Deep in the sterile quiet of the void ward, Dr. Victor calibrated the pressure valve on a heavy, industrial-grade medical injector. The catalyst syringe was an ugly, brutal piece of human engineering. It looked entirely out of place sitting on the pristine diagnostic counter of Outpost 9. Outside the reinforced glass of his remote clinic, the stars hung in the silent vacuum. He was verifying the latest batch of synthesized broad-spectrum antibiotics when the proximity alarms began to scream. Ethelgard warships did not request docking permission. They simply annexed the airspace. Three massive cruisers clamped onto the station's docking ring with a violent shudder. He knew what this meant. The Archon's Royal Guard did not visit border clinics for routine supply runs. They only came when their own perfect systems failed. When the ultimate biological hierarchy crumbles, who do the gods call? Would a primitive healer even want to save an empire that considered his blood a contaminant? Hiss. The clinic door slid open to reveal two Praetorian guards. Their armor was not forged. It was grown from a reactive silicate that shifted constantly to deflect ambient light. They did not speak to Victor. One simply pointed a suppression rifle at his chest. The other began packing his medical kit. The guard tossed the catalyst syringe inside with a careless clatter that made Victor wince. Protocol dictated a formal request for medical transfer. The Ethelgard bypassed protocol entirely. They marched him onto the cruiser in absolute silence. During the faster-than-light transit to the Zenith Citadel, Victor reviewed the intercepted medical files on his datapad. The patient was Princess Elena. The data was a terrifying mess of contradictory readings. The Ethelgard physiology was supposed to be the pinnacle of directed evolution. They had spent millennia splicing out every conceivable flaw. They systematically erased every genetic vulnerability until their immune systems were theoretically impenetrable walls of defense. For clarity, it should be stated that perfection in biology is a dangerous myth. A static system cannot adapt. The princess was experiencing a total systemic cellular collapse. Her body was eating itself because it had forgotten how to recognize new threats. He felt a strange, cold knot of clinical fascination blooming in his chest. The beautiful complexity of their genetic failure was staggering to witness on the molecular level. An elegant, mathematically perfect collapse that demanded a certain clinical reverence from anyone who truly understood the delicate mechanics of advanced cellular biology and targeted immune suppression. Yet sitting right beside that fascination was a heavy, visceral disgust. The sheer hubris required to engineer away the messy, vital fragility that allowed for actual survival was infuriating. They had designed a masterpiece of a body and placed it in an evolutionary vacuum. Upon arrival at the Zenith Citadel, the air itself tasted profoundly different. It was hyper-filtered, aggressively sterile, and lacked the chaotic, metallic tang of his distant outpost. Victor was escorted through hallways of pale, luminescent stone. The Praetorians led him deep into the royal infirmary. The room was vast and intimidating. At the center of the chamber lay Princess Elena. She rested atop a raised diagnostic dais. Archon Valerius stood at the head of the bed. He was a towering figure of crystalline authority. High Counselor Malachor lingered near the shadows of the vaulted ceiling. Matriarch Selene was the only one who turned to look at Victor as he entered. Ethelgard did not show emotion through human facial expressions. Their dermal ridges, composed of a pseudo-crystalline lattice, resonated at different frequencies to convey their internal state. As Victor approached the dais, Malachor's facial ridges vibrated with a sharp, dissonant harmonic. It was a biologically involuntary reaction to the presence of something completely impure. His bioluminescent pulse flickered into a harsh, erratic violet. and the counselor was quite literally repulsed by the human's physical proximity. Victor ignored the harmonic static. He stepped up to the diagnostic bed. Princess Elena was incredibly pale. Her skin lacked the usual pearlescent sheen of her people. It had taken on the dull, matte texture of dying coral. Victor pulled his scanner from his kit. He needed to verify the cellular degradation rate before he could even attempt a synthesis. He placed his hand near her shoulder to align the scanner. The room felt completely silent. It was a silence so absolute it felt heavy. In that heavy, breathless quiet, Victor heard it, a slight, arrhythmic humming sound. It was a misaligned ventilation fan vibrating against a housing panel somewhere high in the vaulted ceiling. He found himself staring blindly at the ornate metal grate, when wondering exactly how many planetary cycles that tiny mechanical flaw had been vibrating out of alignment while the most powerful beings in the galaxy stood below it and worshiped their own absolute flawlessness. He shook his head. He dragged his focus back to the readouts. The numbers were catastrophic. If her leukocyte equivalents are actively suppressing the... No, it doesn't matter. The cellular collapse is already cascading. He abandoned the thought entirely. Tracing the symptom was useless when the foundation itself was missing. The illness was pure genetic stagnation. The Ethelgard had removed the chaotic variables of natural mutation. They left her DNA completely rigid. When a novel pathogen finally breached the perimeter, her cells simply had no instructions on how to bend. They could only break. "Well," Victor said, with his voice sounding entirely too loud in the cavernous infirmary, "your medicine will not save her." Archon Valerius stepped forward. His crystalline armor shifted ominously. "Our medicine is absolute. You were brought here to identify the anomaly, human, not to question our design." "The design is the anomaly," Victor replied. He kept his tone carefully neutral. "You bred out adaptability. She needs a bridge, a chaotic sequence to jumpstart the immune response and teach her cells how to recognize the threat." Matriarch Selene leaned closer. "A chimera catalyst. You are speaking of splicing." High Counselor Malachor stepped out of the shadows. His voice was a cold, cutting resonance. "Splicing with what? We have exhausted all sanctioned genetic libraries within the Empire." Victor reached into his confiscated kit. He pulled out the heavy, industrial catalyst syringe. He turned the metal valve, feeling the satisfying heavy click of the pressure lock engaging. He deliberately avoided looking at the Archon. While preparing the forbidden synthetic matrix that would fundamentally alter the royal bloodline, he completely avoided the staggering political and religious weight of the heresy by hyperfixating on the exact mechanical calibration of the catalyst syringe's secondary pressure release valve. If the pressure was off by a fraction of a bar, the delivery would fail. "You don't need a sanctioned library," Victor said softly. He finally looked up from the syringe. "You need something messy, something highly adaptable and completely impure." The silence that followed was terrifying. They all knew exactly what he was implying. Now to mix Ethelgard royalty with human DNA was a heresy punishable by immediate dissolution. It was an unthinkable contamination. Heresy, the perfection. It was killing her. "You will prepare this catalyst," Valerius commanded, his bioluminescence dimmed to a dangerous bruised purple. "You have until the final planetary rotation. If her vital signs cease, you will not leave this citadel alive." He nodded once. He had a week to play God with the biology of beings who already considered themselves divine. The Zenith Citadel Infirmary offered no sanctuary for a primitive. Victor worked in a sequestered glass alcove adjacent to the royal dais, isolated from the towering, silent figures of the imperial court. He opened his personal medical kit and withdrew a thick extraction needle. He did not hesitate. He drove the steel into his own forearm. I'm watching his messy, iron-rich human blood fill the collection vial. It was a stark, violent crimson under the harsh, pale lighting of the Ethelgard sanctuary. He placed the vial into the sequence analyzer. To create the chimera catalyst, he had to map his chaotic genetic markers directly onto the failing rigid lattice of the princess. This required continuous, real-time calibration. He walked back out to the main chamber. The Praetorian guards stiffened, their armor rippling with defensive microfractures. But Archon Valerius raised a hand to halt them. Victor stepped onto the raised dais. He needed a localized tissue reading to match the degradation rate of her cells. He reached out and wrapped his bare fingers lightly around Princess Elena's wrist. Her skin was terrifyingly cold. It felt like polished marble left out in a winter storm. Yet the moment his human heat transferred to her flesh, a faint bioluminescent shimmer fluttered beneath her dermal ridges. It was a microscopic rebellion. The biological truth of their connection surfaced entirely through proximity. The Ethelgard had engineered away the friction of life, believing friction was a flaw. They failed to realize that without friction, there is no spark. His human body was a chaotic furnace of overlapping biological systems, and her stagnant, perfect veins desperately craved that heat. He watched the synthetic enzyme bind to the royal genetic sequence on his portable holographic display. The messy, chaotic human strands aggressively overwriting the stagnant perfection of her ancestors with a brutal vitality that made the entire imperial court look like fragile glass statues waiting to shatter in a high wind. It was heresy. It was also the only mathematical certainty in the room. Too perfect, dead perfect. Victor sat on the edge of the narrow supply cot in the adjacent synthesis room, his muscles burning with a heavy exhaustion. He dragged a hand down his face, staring at the final mixing chamber. I just need to bypass the centrifuge's primary optical sensor, and then the synthesis will a black-masked assassin's blade plunged into the mattress of the infirmary cot, missing Victor's skull by a fraction of an inch as he rolled violently onto the cold floor. The attacker wore stealth armor that absorbed the ambient light. Victor scrambled backward. His hand blindly closed around the heavy metal grip of the catalyst syringe resting on the counter. It was loaded with a lethal concentration of medical sedative, intended for the heavy biofilters of the Royal Guard, not a human weapon. The assassin lunged again. Victor did not try to match the alien speed. He waited for the strike, twisted inside the guard's reach, and drove the thick, industrial needle directly into the unarmored joint beneath the attacker's shoulder plate. He depressed the heavy pressure valve completely. The assassin collapsed instantly. The stealth mask disengaged, revealing the distinct, jagged dermal ridges of a Praetorian loyal exclusively to High Counselor Malachor. Before Victor could even process the treason, the main infirmary alarms began to shriek. Princess Elena was crashing. Victor sprinted back into the main chamber with the final, unpressurized vial of the true chimera catalyst. Her pseudo-crystalline skin had gone entirely dark. Her chest was still. She was experiencing total cardiac failure. He shattered the safety seal on a prohibited human neural stabilizer. Archon Valerius shouted a command, but Victor ignored the absolute authority of the Emperor. He climbed directly onto the royal dais. He pressed his bare hands against her chest to locate the primary vascular node. The biological reality of their disparate species vanished entirely in the desperate heat his human body transferred to her freezing, stagnant veins. He drove the stabilizer deep into her chest, simultaneously overriding the intravenous feed with a chaotic human-spliced serum. During his frantic compressions, a single, A stray drop of the glowing chimera catalyst spilled. It beaded perfectly on the sterile, interlocking floor tiles, holding its absolute surface tension under the citadel's artificial gravity, while an empire's air died above it. Elena gasped. Her back arched violently as the impure, chaotic human genetics ignited her rigid immune system, flooding her dermal ridges with a blinding, terrifyingly vibrant pulse of deep crimson light. She was breathing. The color returning to her skin was not the pearlescent, flawless sheen of her ancestors. It was a flushed, vibrant, aggressive tone of life, fighting to sustain itself. Her eyes opened, finding Victor instantly in the chaotic room. The ambient temperature of her body spiked, radiating a warmth that forced the Archon to step back. Silence reclaimed the vast infirmary. The mechanical alarm ceased. Archon Valerius stared at his daughter, then slowly turned his gaze to the human kneeling on the dais. The Emperor of the Ethelgard, the absolute ruler of the most advanced species in the known galaxy, slowly descended to one knee. He bowed his head before a primitive. The political shockwave was immediate. High Counselor Malakor's facial ridges vibrated in sheer terror before the loyalist Praetorians seized him, dragging the traitor into the shadows. Valerius stood, his bioluminescence settling into a solemn, heavy blue. The Archon acknowledged the impossible debt, but the laws of the Empire could not be undone in a single rotation. A traditionalist uprising was already brewing in the outer colonies. To protect the newly reborn princess, the source of the heresy had to be removed. Doctor. Victor was officially and permanently exiled from Ethelgard space, escorted back to his vessel before the Citadel even processed what had occurred. 2 days later, in the silent vacuum of faster-than-light transit, the encrypted communication console on Victor's stolen transport flared to life. The audio was entirely clear, stripped of official Imperial filters. "You gave me more than a cure, Doctor." Princess Elena's voice resonated through the cabin, carrying a new dangerous warmth that defied every biological law her people had ever written. "You gave me claws. We have a rigid, decaying empire to dismantle, and I am going to need my physician." Victor sat alone in the dim cockpit of the transport. The encrypted audio file finished playing, plunging the cabin back into the quiet hum of the warp drive. On the console beside the navigation display rested the empty catalyst syringe, its heavy industrial metal still faintly warm, carrying the invisible ghost of a royal bloodline forever changed.